Christianity, the rise of a global empire. A story of blood, betrayal, and the most dangerous idea in history. They have turned the world upside down. Acts 17 verse 6. The executioner's sword gleamed in the afternoon sun as it fell toward Stephen's neck. Blood pooled in the dust as the young deacon's life ebbed away, his final words echoing across the stones. Lord, do not hold this sin against them. In the crowd, a young man named Saul clutched the cloaks of those throwing stones, his eyes burning with righteous fury. He had dedicated his life to hunting down these Christians, these dangerous cultists who dared claim their executed rabbi was God. Within 5 years, this same man would be Christianity's greatest champion, writing letters that would reshape human civilization. His name would become Paul, and his transformation would prove that the most unlikely people can become the most powerful agents of change. But Saul's story is just the beginning. This is the story of Christianity, not as a series of dates and councils, but as a human drama of impossible conversions, deadly betrayals, and the most dangerous idea ever conceived, that the weak could inherit the earth. Chapter 1. The Reluctant Revolutionary. His name was Saul of Tarsus, and he was everything the early Christians feared. Born into privilege, educated in the finest schools, fluent in Greek philosophy and Jewish law. He was the kind of man who could have had a comfortable life as a scholar or politician. Instead, he chose to become a hunter of men. The Christians called him the Destroyer. He would arrive in a city with legal documents, round up believers, and drag them to prison. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. To Saul, they were all cancerous growths on the body of Judaism that needed to be cut out. But on a dusty road to Damascus, everything changed. The light that struck him down wasn't gentle. Ancient accounts describe it as brighter than the sun, so intense it burned his retinas and left him blind for days. His horse reared, throwing him to the ground. His companions dove for cover, terrified by the voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? The voice spoke in perfect Hebrew, yet somehow Saul understood it in his bones, in his blood, in the deepest part of his soul. Who are you, Lord? Saul gasped from the dirt, his expensive robes now torn and stained. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. In that moment, everything Saul believed about reality crumbled. The man he thought was a dead heretic was speaking to him. The movement he devoted his life to destroying was led by someone who was very much alive. For 3 days, Saul sat in darkness, refusing food and water. When a Christian named Ananias finally came to heal his blindness, Saul had become Paul. He would never be the same. But here's what makes Paul's conversion so remarkable. He didn't just switch sides. He revolutionized Christianity itself. Chapter 2. The Debate That Split History. The Jerusalem church was in chaos. Reports were flooding in from across the Roman Empire. Paul was telling Gentiles they could become Christians without becoming Jews first. No circumcision, no dietary laws, no Sabbath observance. The original apostles were horrified. James, the brother of Jesus, led the Jerusalem church with strict Jewish observance. Peter, despite his own visions, wavered between accepting Gentiles and keeping Jewish law. The confrontation came to a head in Jerusalem around 50 CE. The room was packed with apostles, elders, and witnesses. The air was thick with tension as Paul stood before the men who had walked with Jesus. Brothers, Paul began, his voice steady despite the hostile stares. I stand before you as proof that God's grace knows no boundaries. If salvation comes through faith in Jesus, then the law is irrelevant. If the law is necessary, then Jesus died for nothing. The room erupted. Voices rose in anger. Some apostles stood, shouting. Others sat in stunned silence. These weren't abstract theological debates. They were arguments about the very nature of God's plan for humanity. Peter rose slowly, his weathered hands trembling. I have seen the Spirit fall on Gentiles just as it fell on us at Pentecost. Who am I to stand in God's way? Then James, the brother of Jesus himself, stood up. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Brothers, listen to me. God has shown us that he accepts people from every nation who fear him and do what is right. The decision they reached that day changed the world. Christianity would be universal, not ethnic. It would be about faith, not blood. It would be for everyone, not just the chosen few. But the cost was enormous. The Jerusalem church, led by Jesus' own family and disciples, would eventually fade into history. The future belonged to Paul's vision of a faith that transcended race, class, and nationality. Chapter 3: The Beast and the Lamb. Nero's Rome was a city of excess and terror. The emperor who sang while the city burned had turned sadism into an art form. When fire destroyed half of Rome in 64 CE, Nero needed someone to blame. The Christians were perfect scapegoats. What followed was a horror that defies imagination. Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes Christians covered with the skins of beasts, torn by dogs and perishing, or nailed to crosses, or doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. But here's the detail that haunts history. Nero used Christians as human torches to light his garden parties. Men, women, and children were tied to stakes, covered in pitch, and set on fire to provide lighting for the emperor's entertainment. Yet something extraordinary happened in those flames. Instead of breaking the Christian movement, the persecutions made it stronger. A young slave girl named Blandina was brought to the amphitheater in Lyon. She was 17, sold into slavery as a child, worth less than a good horse to her Roman masters. For days, she was tortured in ways too horrific to describe. Her tormentors expected her to renounce her faith. Instead, she kept repeating, "I am a Christian, and nothing vile happens among us." On the final day, they tied her to a stake in the arena. As wild beasts circled below, she lifted her eyes to heaven and began to sing. The crowd of 50,000 Romans fell silent. They had come to see a spectacle of death, but instead they witnessed something they couldn't understand. A teenage slave girl who faced death with more courage than their greatest heroes. When they finally killed her, grown men wept. Even the executioners were shaken. This girl, this nobody, had shown them what it meant to be truly free. Stories like Blandina's spread throughout the empire. People began to ask, what kind of faith gives a slave girl the courage to face death like this? What do these Christians know that we don't? The blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. Chapter 4: The Gambler Emperor. Constantine was losing. As he marched toward Rome in 312 CE, he knew the odds were against him. His rival Maxentius controlled the capital, the treasury, and the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. Constantine had maybe 40,000 men. Maxentius had 100,000. The night before the battle at Milvian Bridge, Constantine couldn't sleep. He was a career soldier, a pragmatist who worshipped the sun god Sol Invictus. But his mother Helena had whispered Christian prayers over his cradle, and something in those prayers had never left him. What happened next changed the course of human history. According to Constantine's own account, he saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with Greek words, "En tuto nika," in this sign, conquer. That night, he claimed Christ appeared to him in a dream, telling him to paint the Christian symbol on his soldiers' shields. Constantine faced a choice that would define his legacy: trust in the God of his ancestors, or gamble everything on the God of the crucified carpenter. He chose the gamble. The next morning, Constantine's soldiers charged into battle with Christian symbols blazing on their shields. By evening, Maxentius was dead, drowned in the Tiber River as his forces fled. Constantine was emperor of Rome. But was his conversion real, or the most brilliant political calculation in history? The evidence is conflicting. Constantine delayed his baptism until his deathbed, a common practice, but suspicious. He continued to mint coins with pagan symbols. He still held the title Pontifex Maximus, high priest of the Roman gods. Yet his actions spoke louder than his doubts. He made Christianity legal, funded massive church construction, and ensured his sons were raised Christian. Most importantly, he called the Council of Nicaea to settle Christianity's greatest crisis. Chapter 5: The Council of Blood. The year was 325 CE, and Christianity was tearing itself apart. The crisis began with a priest named Arius in Alexandria. Arius asked a simple question that threatened everything. If Jesus is God, and God is one, then aren't Christians polytheists? His answer was logical. Jesus was the first and greatest of God's creations, but still created. He was divine, but not equal to the Father. To Arius, this preserved monotheism while honoring Jesus. The response was explosive. Riots erupted in Alexandria. Bishops chose sides. The unity Constantine had hoped Christianity would bring to his empire was fracturing into civil war. Constantine summoned bishops from across the empire to the city of Nicaea. 300 men gathered in the imperial palace, many bearing scars from the recent persecutions. These weren't academic theologians. They were battle-hardened survivors who had seen their friends die for their faith. The debate was vicious. Bishop Hosius of Cordova, Constantine's advisor, led the orthodox position. Jesus was homoousios, with the Father of the same substance. Arius and his supporters countered that Jesus was homoousios, of similar substance. The difference was a single letter, an I, but it represented two completely different understandings of God. The council sided with Hosius. The Nicene Creed declared Jesus true God and true man, fully divine and fully human. Arius was exiled, his books burned, his followers condemned. But the story doesn't end there. Within years, Arian Christianity spread among the Germanic tribes. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals all embraced Arian Christianity. When Rome fell in 476 CE, it was conquered by Christian barbarians who believed the Roman Church was heretical. The irony was perfect. Christianity had conquered Rome, but the wrong kind of Christianity. Chapter 6. The Heretic Who Saved Christianity. By 1517, the Catholic Church had become everything Jesus had opposed. The Pope lived in luxury while peasants starved. Priests sold forgiveness for money. The Church owned 1/3 of Europe's land while preaching poverty. Into this corruption stepped an unlikely revolutionary, Martin Luther, a neurotic monk who was terrified of God's judgment. Luther's crisis began with a simple question: how can I know I'm saved? The Catholic Church said salvation came through good works, sacraments, and papal authority. But Luther had tried it all: fasting, prayer, pilgrimage, confession, and still felt condemned. The breaking point came when Johann Tetzel arrived in Germany selling indulgences. Tetzel's sales pitch was obscene. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. People were buying forgiveness for sins they hadn't even committed yet. Luther was appalled. On October 31st, 1517, he wrote 95 theses, academic arguments against the sale of indulgences, and nailed them to the castle church door in Wittenberg. He expected a scholarly debate. Instead, he got a revolution. Thanks to the printing press, Luther's theses spread across Europe in weeks. Suddenly, every peasant and prince was reading arguments that struck at the heart of papal authority. Luther's central claim was revolutionary. Salvation comes through faith alone, not through church rituals. The Pope summoned Luther to Rome. Luther refused. The Pope sent representatives to Germany. Luther burned the papal bull in public. Finally, Emperor Charles V summoned Luther to the Diet of Worms. Standing before the most powerful men in Europe, Luther was given one final chance to recant. His response became the battle cry of the Protestant Reformation: "Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen." But Luther's revolution had a dark side. When German peasants used his teachings to justify rebellion against their lords, Luther sided with the nobility. When radical reformers like Thomas Munzer preached social revolution, Luther called for their execution. The man who had challenged papal authority became an authority himself, determining who was truly reformed and who was dangerously radical. Chapter 7. The Missionary's Dilemma. Francis Xavier knelt on the beach at Kagoshima, Japan, watching his translator butcher everything he was trying to say. It was 1549, and Xavier had already traveled 20,000 miles to bring Christianity to Asia. But Japan was proving his greatest challenge. The Japanese were sophisticated, educated, and asked uncomfortable questions. If Christianity is true, they asked, why did God wait so long to reveal it to us? Are all our ancestors in hell because they never heard of Jesus? Xavier had no good answers. The Christianity he preached was European Christianity, shaped by Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Germanic customs. But the Japanese had their own ancient traditions, their own understanding of the divine. Xavier faced a choice that would define missionary work for centuries. Should Christianity adapt to local cultures, or should local cultures adapt to Christianity? In Japan, Xavier tried adaptation. He learned the language, studied Buddhist philosophy, and presented Christianity in terms the Japanese could understand. He even adopted the dress and customs of Buddhist monks. The results were remarkable. Within a few years, there were 100,000 Japanese Christians. But success brought persecution. The Japanese rulers saw Christianity as a foreign invasion, a threat to their authority. The persecution that followed was horrific. Christians were crucified upside down, boiled alive, or forced to step on images of Jesus to prove they had renounced their faith. The hidden Christians of Japan practiced their faith in secret for over 200 years. But Xavier's experiment in adaptation had planted a seed. Christianity didn't have to be European. It could be Japanese, Chinese, Indian, African, as long as it remained recognizably Christian. Chapter 8. The Slave's Gospel. Her name was Jarena Lee, and she was not supposed to exist. Born into slavery in 1783, she had no right to preach, no right to teach, no right to claim divine authority. She was a black woman in a world ruled by white men. But Jarena Lee believed God had called her to preach, and she would not be silenced. The Christianity that emerged in slave communities was different from the Christianity of their masters. While white preachers used the Bible to justify slavery, quoting verses about servants obeying their masters, black preachers heard a different message. They heard about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. They heard about Jesus blessing the poor and condemning the rich. They heard about a God who cared about suffering and promised justice. This was liberation theology before the term existed. It was Christianity as resistance, as hope, as a weapon against oppression. Jarena Lee's breakthrough came when she stood up in a church service where the male preacher was struggling. She began to speak, and the congregation was transformed. Even the preacher admitted she had been called by God. But the church hierarchy refused to ordain her. Women, especially black women, were not allowed to preach. So Jarena Lee became an itinerant preacher, traveling thousands of miles on foot, preaching to anyone who would listen. Her message was simple but revolutionary. If the man may preach, because the Savior died for him, why not the woman? Seeing he died for her also. By the time she died in 1849, Jarena Lee had preached to thousands and inspired a generation of black women preachers. She had proven that Christianity belonged to everyone, not just the powerful. Chapter 9. The Underground Revolution. The mountain villages of China were about to witness something unprecedented. It was 1900, and the Boxer Rebellion was sweeping across the country like wildfire, targeting foreign influences, especially Christianity. Villages burned. Missionaries fled. The slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreign," echoed from Beijing to the remotest provinces. But in a small village in Shaanxi province, an extraordinary sight unfolded. As Boxer rebels approached, expecting to find cowering foreigners, they instead discovered something that stopped them cold. Chinese Christians kneeling in prayer, led by a man who had never seen a Western face. His name was Pastor Hsi, and his story would prove that the most powerful revolutions begin in the most unexpected places. How had Christianity taken root in remote villages where no missionary had ever traveled? The answer lay in the courage of ordinary people who carried forbidden books across dangerous mountain passes. Chinese merchants returning from coastal cities brought Christian texts hidden in their rice sacks. Farmers smuggled Bibles in their grain carts. Slowly, secretly, a network of Chinese Christians emerged in the most unlikely places. But this Chinese Christianity was unique. Cut off from Western influence, it developed its own character. Chinese Christians emphasized community, sharing in a culture of individual survival. They practiced forgiveness in a society built on revenge. They spoke of spiritual equality in a rigidly hierarchical world. Pastor Hsi embodied this transformation. Once a hopeless opium addict who had sold his own children to buy drugs, he had found healing through Christian faith. He established clinics that combined prayer with medicine, treating both addiction and disease. When former addicts relapsed, he didn't condemn them. He wept with them and helped them start again. The persecution that followed was brutal. Entire villages of Chinese Christians were massacred, their houses burned, their children killed. Foreign missionaries became the scapegoats, but the real targets were the Chinese converts who had embraced this foreign faith. As the Boxer rebels surrounded his village, Pastor Hsi's followers begged him to flee. He could have escaped to the coast, found safety with the foreign powers. Instead, he stood in the doorway of his clinic, facing men who had come to kill him. "I am Chinese," he told his terrified congregation. "This is my country, these are my people. If I must die for my faith, I will die here, among you." The rebels expected him to beg for his life. Instead, Pastor Hsi did something that would haunt their dreams forever. He began to pray for them. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They killed him there, in the doorway, surrounded by the medicine bottles and prayer books that had saved so many lives. But his final words spread through the rebellion like a virus. Tell them Jesus loves them too." The Christianity that emerged from the Boxer Rebellion was thoroughly Chinese, yet recognizably Christian. It proved that the gospel could take root in any soil and flourish in any culture, not through the power of empires, but through the courage of ordinary people who believed that love was stronger than hate. By 1950, China had more Christians than any European nation. The Christianity that survived persecution was not the Christianity of Western missions, but the Christianity of Chinese hearts, transformed by the same message that had changed lives in Jerusalem 2,000 years before. Chapter 10. The Unexpected Ending. Today, as I write this, Christianity is experiencing its greatest transformation since the time of Paul. Walk into a church in Lagos, Nigeria, and you'll find 50,000 people worshiping with an intensity that would make medieval monks seem restrained. Visit a favela in Sao Paulo, and you'll discover former drug dealers now running soup kitchens and schools. Travel to the Philippines, and you'll meet teenage missionaries who've memorized entire books of the Bible. The typical Christian is no longer a white European or American. She is a young woman in Nigeria, Brazil, or the Philippines. She speaks Portuguese, Igbo, or Tagalog. She worships in a style that would seem foreign to medieval European Christians, but familiar to first-century believers. This Christianity is more charismatic, more emotional, more focused on healing and prosperity than the austere Protestantism of Northern Europe. It's more concerned with social justice than individual salvation. It's more communal than individual. It's more about miracles than theology. In other words, it's returning to its roots. The Christianity that conquered Rome was not the Christianity of cathedrals and kings. It was the Christianity of slaves and outcasts, of healers and prophets, of people who believed that the last would be first and the first would be last. As I look at the numbers, 2.6 billion Christians worldwide and growing. I'm struck by how the story that began with 20 frightened disciples in Jerusalem has become the most successful movement in human history. But the most staggering statistic isn't the total number. It's the rate of growth. Christianity is expanding faster today than at any point in its 2,000-year history. Every day, 175,000 people become Christians. Every hour, 7,300 people decide to follow Jesus. Every minute, 122 people cross the line from unbelief to faith. But success has never been the point. The point has always been transformation. The transformation of individuals, communities, and ultimately the world. Paul the persecutor became Paul the apostle. Constantine the pagan became Constantine the Christian. Luther the monk became Luther the reformer. Jarena Lee the slave became Jarena Lee the preacher. Pastor Hsi the opium addict became Pastor Hsi the healer. The pattern is always the same. The most unlikely people become the most powerful agents of change. The most impossible transformations become the most necessary ones. Perhaps that's the real secret of Christianity's success. It doesn't just offer hope for the world, it offers hope for ourselves. It says that no one is too far gone, no one is too broken, no one is too sinful to be transformed. It says that the story isn't over yet, not for humanity, not for civilization, not for you. In a world that often feels hopeless, that's a message worth dying for. It's a message that has sustained believers through persecution, sustained reformers through rejection, sustained missionaries through failure. And after 2,000 years, it's still transforming lives, one unlikely conversion at a time. The carpenter from Nazareth who died on a Roman cross had promised his followers, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." 2,000 years later, that promise has held true not through the power of emperors or the wisdom of scholars, but through the faith of ordinary people who believed that love was stronger than death, that hope was stronger than despair, that light was stronger than darkness. That's the real story of Christianity, not the rise of an empire, but the triumph of an idea so radical, so dangerous, so transformative that it changed everything it touched. And it's still changing the world, one heart at a time. The revolution continues.
This was Hugh from World History Marathon. Thanks for listening, and I hope this journey through time left you with more questions than answers, because that's where curiosity begins. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people, choices, and consequences that echo into our world today. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves peeling back the layers of the past. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop exploring the truth behind the headlines. See you in the next chapter of history.